Hello, I'm Antoaneta Banu from Adevărul Live. Today we are talking about destination branding or place branding, a new concept in Romania. Our special guest is Robert Govers, President of the International Place Branding Association and author of the award-winning book Imaginative Communities. Hello, Mr. Govers, and welcome to Romania. Welcome to Adevărul Live via Zoom.
Thank you very much. Good day to you. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to meet you, and I have a few questions for you. Look, Americans are loud. Amsterdam equals sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Mexicans are lazy, and Germans are boring but punctual. Paris is romantic, Wuhan infectious, Ukrainian heroic, and New Zealand untouched. Is the quote posted on the new cover of your book Imaginative Communities? Mr. Govers, loud, boring, romantic, this is the way people think about cities, about countries, through stereotypes. Can those image problem be resolved with a classic model of tourism promotion or advertising campaign? What do you think?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good question, and thank you for reading the first few lines of my book cover, because I think this is, of course, indeed the challenge that we face when we talk about place branding or reputation management for places. Because it is a huge challenge, because on the one hand, external audiences think about places in terms of cliches and stereotypes, which they have learned from a long time ago, very often in their childhood, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have these places, which, of course, as we all know, are very complex, and identities of communities, identities of cities, identities of the people living in cities are very complex things, and they're very diverse and heterogeneous. And so to bridge this aspect of identity, of the complexity of a place versus the simplicity of how it's being perceived, that's really the challenge of how we manage the brand or the reputation, if you like, of a place. And this is a challenging task, because indeed, as you seem to infer, is that it's almost impossible, and many places believe that it is, it is possible to change that through advertising on radio and television, or maybe on social media, and doing campaigns, and then we will become famous and people will change their minds about us. But all the research shows that that doesn't work. So what does work is to show the reputation that you think you deserve by action, by policies, by initiatives, by investment, by projects, etc., etc.
Mr. Govers, you know many places over the world. Please help me to understand why some cities or countries are so admired and others are not. What makes the difference?
Well, as I alluded to already, because you inferred, or you seemed to suggest earlier, that cliches and stereotypes need to be changed. Well, that's not necessarily always the case. So cliches and stereotypes in many cases can work to your advantage. For instance, of course, when we think of Germany, we think of Gründlichkeit, the thoroughness in which they do things in Germany, and therefore they produce high-quality automotive industry products and consumer goods, particularly electronics. So it works to their advantage. That stereotype is beneficial to the country. And even a country where I'm from, the Netherlands, where we are famous for our tulips and windmills, they might seem outdated, which they are to some extent, and it leads to a lot of frustration among the administration because they want to update their image. But on the other hand, those are quite positive associations. The tulips and the clogs and the windmills are not necessarily bad for your reputation, and they might actually be a window into the country, might be a way to access the audience and therefore be able to influence additional associations that you might want to build for the country. The real problem is two things. It's either awareness, so people have never heard of you, which is often the case. Many cities, regions, and countries are just not known. When people hear the name, they have not really any idea what you're talking about, or that they've heard of it, but they don't know very much about it. The cases where the cliches and stereotypes are negative are actually quite few. There's only few places that are really struggling with a very bad reputation. Of course, I don't want to get into politics, but we probably know which places we're talking about. So usually the challenge is unawareness, people not knowing anything about you, or having very limited or no idea whatsoever, even though that they've heard of you, not know anything about it. And that's, of course, you can change by showing people that interesting things are happening. Now, the places that are famous and that have positive reputations have often been built up over very long periods of time. So I mentioned Germany, I mentioned the Netherlands, I mentioned United States of America, Amsterdam, New York, London, Paris. Of course, metropolises, big cities that have established themselves over many years and therefore have been able to get into the global consciousness of global audiences.
Mr. Govers, when I say place branding or destination branding, I think logo, I think visual identity, I think element identity. I think
yes.
A cliche. It's correct? Well,
absolutely right. So this is the misperception of people in the policymakers, particularly people that are interested in as clients and as sometimes even consultants are interested in place branding. They think, it's brand, and therefore what we do in commercial branding, what we do for products and services, can be done in the same way for places. And therefore people immediately think, so this must be about logo and visual identity. Now, places, of course, aren't products, right? Cities are not being sold. Sure, there are product-market combinations. So places have a tourism product for tourists, have an investment product for potential investors. They may have a higher education system that they're trying to market for foreign students. You might want to attract talented people to certain industries. You might be exporting products, and therefore there's an export market. But those are very diverse markets. And contrary to in commercial branding, where the brand is usually specifically linked to a certain product or at least a certain type of market, this is very difficult to do for places. And therefore, a place as a whole is not being sold. And therefore, we need to distinguish between product-market combinations and marketing activities like tourism marketing, investment promotion, etc., versus managing the reputation of the city. And to think that that can be done through packaging, where, of course, packaging in the commercial world is important because products are being sold in the supermarket, where we need to make a quick decision which brand to buy, so visual identity and logos are important. This is not at all the case when we're talking about cities, regions, and countries, because they're not in the supermarket, they're not being sold. The marketing of these places is extremely complex, diverse, and heterogeneous. And also, and this is mainly the main difference between commercial branding and place branding, is that in commercial branding as a corporation, we have control over what we call the touch points. So we have almost complete control over how the brand engages with audiences. Now, as cities, regions, and countries, you don't, because cities, regions, and countries are constantly being talked about in the mainstream media and in the social media, regardless whether it shows the logo or not. Usually, 99.9% of the time, the logo isn't showed when people and journalists and social media coverage and people talk about places. So to think that we can control that reputation, all that conversation and engagement with visual identity is basically ludicrous.
When I say place branding or branding destination, it's about people, it's about the feelings, it's about emotions, it's about experience.
Yes.
It's correct. Oh, I'm very good.
Yeah, it is. So you want to show audiences the reputation that you think that you deserve by doing what I would call imaginative stuff. So imaginative initiatives, things that will get into people's consciousness, that will dominate the narrative of how people talk about places. Because as I mentioned earlier, we don't have control over the touch points. It's very difficult. So what we want to try and do is influence the narrative that is being projected in the mainstream and social media. And maybe it helps to give an example to understand what I'm talking about. For instance, Estonia, of course, a country that has only recently become independent of the Soviet Union, has really been successful in building its name awareness and actually attaching a positive association to it in terms of being the most advanced e-state on the planet. So they were the first country to write into the constitution that internet access should be a human right. Then they created a whole e-government system, and then they came up with the idea of a digital nomad visa, an e-residency program. And these have really become quite dominant stories in the international media where people are saying, hold on, have you heard of this country? There's something interesting going on there. And those are real things. They're actual, there's an actual e-government, there's an actual e-residency program. You can become an e-resident of Estonia. They have an identity card with a chip code, so you can buy property, open a bank account, stuff like that in the country without necessarily ever having to go to Estonia. So those are really interesting initiatives where they were the first one to do it, and they attracted a positive narrative. So you need to have a strategy. You need to understand how you want to position yourself as a place. So you need to have a positioning strategy. What do we want to become famous for? And then implement that through action, through government policy, but also, most importantly, through collaboration with private sector, so that private sector companies are also on brand, reinforcing the brand engagement, as well as civil society, where you might get cultural industries and sports associations also getting involved in creating this narrative for the nation or the narrative for the city.
Yes, Estonia is a very good example. And if you say Estonia, how can Romanians invigorate communities and city spirits and build reputations? Some advice for us, please.
Yeah, so getting together, collaboration is extremely important, because this cannot be neither a top-down nor a bottom-up thing. It's got to be both. So, as I mentioned before, you need a positioning strategy. So you need to bring people together, government, senior government officials. When we're talking about a city, we're talking about the mayor and the alderman. If you're talking about the country, you need to get the cabinet, the prime minister, president involved. So it needs to be supported from the top. You need to get top involvement, because you need them to be committed to the positioning strategy that will be the result of the process, but also bring in civil society and the private sector, so representatives of associations, of cultural industries, of major exporting companies. Of course, you need to bring in the stakeholders of all the what we call externally facing agencies, like the Export Promotion Agency, the Tourism Agency, the Foreign Investment Agency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Public Diplomacy Unit. You need to bring all these people together to build a both bottom-up and at the same time bottom-up and top-down strategy, positioning strategy that people can commit to, and then create the structures and systems to start implementing that positioning strategy in the things that you do.
And I think we need a very strong vision about us and about our country. Okay, last question, Mr. Govers. Unfortunately, we are living in times of crisis, and in this context, how does destination branding or place branding help countries, cities, and nations? How can destination branding or place branding help a country or a community to go through these times of crisis?
Yes, thank you very much. And this is a very important question, because actually, if you have a positioning strategy and you know what you're trying to achieve, that will definitely help you also in times of crisis, because it will give you a framework within which you can imagine how you can respond to a crisis. And I'll go back to the example of Estonia. So when everybody else in Europe, the European countries and governments, were running around like headless chickens thinking what to do and how to respond to this COVID pandemic a few years ago, the Estonian government, the first thing that they did is they financed what they called the crisis hackathon. So obviously, because they are the most advanced e-state in the world, they've got this huge and advanced tech cluster in Estonia with lots of tech entrepreneurs and smart people, understanding artificial intelligence and technology and programming and what have you. They brought these people together immediately to get them to think about how can we tackle this pandemic. So within no time, they had the tracking and tracing apps and things like that, where other countries took months and months to develop. They were quite quick in doing that. Another thing that they did is they invented this, what I referred to earlier, the digital nomad visa. So they actually created a visa program where non-Europeans and Europeans alike, but particularly non-Europeans, they could get a visa for a year to come and work from their new home in Estonia. Of course, the narrative was that everybody was now working from home because of the pandemic. There was a stay-at-home guidelines from most governments in the world, so people were working from their home, and they said, well, then you can make Estonia your new home, come and live here, we'll give you a digital nomad visa, and you can buy property, you can rent property, you can open a bank account and live here in Estonia and work in your current job from your new home. So keep your job, but come and work from your home, your new home in Estonia. So they're very clever initiatives. Real initiative, it's a real program, and people actually made use of it. But of course, it was also a very interesting narrative for the media. So where most countries were getting negative press because of how they were dealing with the pandemic, Estonia and Bhutan, by the way, is another example. Bhutan, the country of happiness, where they also had a specifically on-brand, brand-reinforcing way of dealing with the pandemic, they actually received positive media attention. So to have such a strong strategy informs you, is basically, it's a window to policy making, it's a perspective to policy making, and it gives you some guidance and advice and facilitates imagination on how to deal with crises. And by the way, to finish off, you mentioned destination branding versus place branding as though they're synonymous. I would prefer to use the term place branding because it relates to place as a whole. When you talk about destination branding, we basically mean tourism branding, because destination is only used, the word destination is only used in the context of tourism. And to brand a place only from the perspective of tourism is a really bad idea. And we've seen many cases that are now dealing with over-tourism because they've got this unidimensional image of being just a city or a region for tourism, because they're focused so much on tourism branding that is really not a good idea. You want to do overarching place branding for the city, the country, and the region as a whole, across industries.
Yes, I understand, but here in Romania we need both place branding and branding destination. Mr. Govers, thank you very much.